and I'm going to talk a little bit about the models that I use and how it relates maybe to some of the stuff that's happening in SEEP. Then I'm going to talk about the kind of stakeholder engagement that I'm doing at the end, and there may be some opportunities for collaborations if people sort of find the research that I'm doing interesting. Yeah, so actually I changed the title of it, just a couple of words different. I don't know if anyone notices, but I had climate social tipping points, but now I'm talking about positive climate tipping points because they're not all social. There are some other asocial ones, I guess. All right, so DARETOTIP is the name of the project. Everyone has to have a catchy name for their project. I'm not sure how catchy it is, but it was done in the sort of last minutes of, midnight submission, counting down to that final minute, and we decided to go with DARETOTIP. It's a Marie Curie action, and it's where you've got this dot, that's where Aalborg University is, where I'm based. Copenhagen's over here. So it's basically the other end of the country, and it's a real dog leg to get there by train. You've got to come down here. So it's really far away, and everyone says, oh, so how's Copenhagen? But that's not where I live. Yeah, something like that, yeah. And I've been there for 6 months, and it's a 2-year fellowship, but I'm also going to spend 6 months at the PIK, or the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, just outside Berlin, which is where a lot of the climate modelling, the hardcore stuff, gets done, and that's now headed by Johan Rockstrom. So he's moved there. So there's quite a good group of researchers there. I'm going to go and get to spend some time with. Oh yeah, those are some pretty pictures of where my office is. You can't see my office, but it's up the back there without a good view. But there is a really nice view. There is a really nice view of the fjord. So you can see down here there's this really nice sort of development of an old industrial port, and I'm in this quite pretty modern building. I like it anyway. It's all glass, lots of sofas everywhere. So that's a little plug for Aalborg University. It's great. And I think it was recently ranked the best engineering university in Europe. Although I know economists don't always like engineers. So DARETOTIP. There are going to be a few Simpsons memes in here. I like to get a bit of colour in there so that people don't fall asleep. And it's also a provocative invitation to get on board with some of the social tipping points I'm going to talk about. There are 2 objectives in this project. One is the quantitative modelling of these positive climate tipping points that I'll define and talk about a lot more detail. And the second objective is to advance the philosophical debate on individual responsibility and institutional responsibility, which can be really contentious. So I'm going to talk about tipping points first, and then I'm going to talk about system dynamics, which is my sort of favourite core modelling paradigm. I'm going to talk about a couple of scenarios, one to do with commuting in cars and one to do with short-haul flights, 2 ways that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Then I want to talk about stakeholder participation in. So tipping points, everyone's probably heard about tipping points. It's actually a really booming research field right now. Mostly we talk about physical tipping points, climate tipping points, like the Atlantic Meridional Ocean circulation. If that collapses, then we cross a physical tipping point, which will mean Australia gets really hot and Europe gets a bit cooler, and that's going to mess up some of our agricultural systems, obviously. So that's one of the tipping points that's often talked about. Permafrost melt, of course, is greenhouse effect, increases permafrost in Siberia and in northern parts of the planet melt, releasing methane, and then you've got a reinforcing feedback loop. So that's a tipping point we want to avoid. Greenland, ice sheet melt, and so on, right? So these are negative, and we want to try and understand what the early warning signals are, and then choose a path away from that. But we also have social tipping points, and this is maybe more interesting for people who are economists and social geographers. So that's mostly about. It's a ghost. Okay, so social tipping points are actually often positive, and they are about a group of people banding together to try and achieve some positive outcome, right? So behavioural change through, getting together, trying to reach a snowball effect where enough people do something either positive or don't do something negative, that then when that snowball effect reaches a sort of an inflection point, and then we cross this tipping point, and then we can also reach a new state. So I'm talking about those in particular. Global Tipping Points is a report that came out in December last year, and this was released by the University of Exeter. Maybe you've heard of the Professor Timothy Lenton, who's one of the big names in tipping points, and he runs the Tipping Points Research Centre there. And this identified 5 different tipping points. They're not actually all to do with the climate, but they're environmentally related, of course. And in that report, also it's funded by Jeff Bezos, so we have to look at it carefully through that lens, I think. So a lot came out in December, and this has really been a focal point, and there now are lots of sort of breakaway groups and webinar series happening that are really trying to dig apart what was written about in this global tipping points, and I'm sure there'll be some big papers coming out of that soon as well. Going back a few years, in 2020, Otto et al. Published this qualitative sort of understanding of what these social tipping dynamics might be. But this and all the other literature really around climate positive tipping points is not quantitative. It's really hard to make these kind of quantitative models that pull together the social, the cultural, the ecological aspects and link them into an integrated model. But in this paper, they identified what are the expected causal mechanisms that might lead to these social tipping points. So what's really important there is the education system that feeds into the norms and values, and it's that norms and values that we want to change to get new norms and values that are more, let's say, progressive for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So to quantify these, I've broken the whole sort of scope down into top-down and bottom-up. And sorry for the repetition for everyone I've been talking to in the last few days, so you're going to hear the same thing, but top-down is like the interventionist approaches, so it's putting barriers for bad behaviour, of course, and perhaps removing barriers to encourage good behaviour. This could be like climate sort of taxes and this sort of thing, but we also have bottom-up, and that's where I put all of these social value norm type of changes. And they're going to be modelled in this kind of integrated way because they play against each other. So imagine you've got your decision maker, Mayor Quimby, passes a law, has obviously some kind of effect on finance and funding of industry, and then industry changes. But we also have these things like social contagion, or these bottom-up things where a good person like Lisa Simpson decides that she's going to go vegetarian, or that she's not going to, drive a car to work when she gets old enough, that kind of thing. And of course, that when that gets to some kind of critical mass, then that also has an influence, and it gives more political capacity to the decision makers. So there's a reinforcing feedback there, right? So to model this, I draw from a number of kind of methods, let's say, coupled human and nature systems, which is used a lot in the ecological economics, like the ecosystem service modeling, where we talk about these different capitals and how they interact. Industrial ecology, which is a bit more my background, LCA, material flow analysis, and this is the sort of where I source all my let's say emissions factors and input-output kind of data that helps me understand the flows of materials between different sectors. Socio-ecological contagion or social contagion, I'm going to talk actually about that in a couple of slides, but that's obviously this, what you see here, group of people that get together and have a positive environmental effect, and this is all kind of captured under system dynamics. And system dynamics is also something that I think everyone's heard of, and maybe not everyone really knows the details of it unless you've really worked with mathematical modelling. But a classic system dynamics model is the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model. We have these two variables, two stocks, let's say, they're populations, these stocks, and they're interacting, of course, because you've got, you've actually got rabbits and foxes and the foxes are eating the rabbits, and they start to deplete the rabbit population, but then they don't have enough food, so the fox population decreases, and then the rabbit population can increase again. But this could lead to a social collapse. If the foxes decide to annihilate the rabbit population, then you don't see this oscillation, which is a balancing feedback loop. You have a reinforcing feedback loop where you'll have, both populations will die out. A more relevant to my research, oh, it's not working now. Thank you. The World 3 model that came out in 1972, which was what the book Limits to Growth by Donella Meadows was based on, right? So this was linking together social, economic, and environmental variables and looked at resource depletion and pollution generation from using these resources over time as the population increases, and it was largely based on consumption rates per capita. And for those of you who know about the World 3 model and what the Club of Rome were trying to achieve, they were trying to look at lots of different scenarios and try and understand what the early warning signals might be of these multiple scenarios that we could then predict avoiding a collapse or having some kind of social tipping point where the behavior changes and then we avoid that collapse through changes in, for example, food per capita or industrial output per capita, right? So I'm going to talk now about how that food per capita might work with this little illustration of hungry Homer Simpson and Lisa, who wants to do good things. So she's got a bright idea. Homer's pretty traditional and Lisa wants to make a change. She wants to improve the environment. And let's think of this now as two cohorts of the wider population. Most people start in here, and then you might get some thought leaders that say, we want to do something different because Mayor Quimby is not making the right decisions for Springfield, and we really need to start doing something from a people's bottom-up kind of approach, right? So Lisa might go around and start to spread this idea amongst her friends, amongst people who will listen, and much like the sort of the Fridays for the Future movement and this kind of these young people's movement building that's been happening in the last few years, more and more the traditionalists will get convinced that this is a good idea. So they'll adopt these new norms and values, right? So the population shifts from traditionalists to change makers. Of course, the traditionalists are also reproducing, so they're making babies and probably bringing their children up to think about things in the same way that they're doing, probably voting for the same political parties. They're probably still doing their old things, going to the same kind of community events, that kind of stuff. The change makers are also probably bringing up, most of the time, their children, their offspring, to think about things in this new progressive way. We also have these people who revert, who say, that was pretty difficult. I don't think I like that idea anymore, or that was just a phase. I'm going back to, what mum and dad raised me on. Okay, so these fluxes between these two population cohorts are really controlled by the uptake rate, which is basically how many people Lisa convinces to be more like her, and the commitment rate, which is how long they stay in that change makers cohort before they maybe start to get a little bit sick of it. And that's, of course, a reinforcing feedback there, because the more and more change makers you have, the more people feel that they fit in, that they're not the weirdos anymore. Okay, so this can all be modeled, and it has been in this paper that I published a couple of years ago. And I look at different scenarios varying the uptake rate, because this is quite hypothetical. We don't have any of these numbers, but it's to look at how a system dynamics sort of model can follow different scenarios, so with different uptake rates. Basically, the contagion part of this refers to how COVID was modeled, right? So you all remember that we have this R value, and this is how many people get infected from an infectious person. Well, the uptake rate's a little bit like that. It's about how infectious Lisa can make the idea. So if she is getting a lot of people interested in this idea, then it's like the R value is high. And that's a good thing in this case, not like COVID, right? So we can look at this matrix, and with this model that I published, we can compare the commitment rate and the uptake rate. Uptake rate, by the way, doesn't have to be 4, it can go up. I mean, Lisa could be convincing 10 people to this new ideology. Commitment rate is basically just between 0 and 1. It's the number of people who stay in that cohort for every time step in the system dynamics model. What you see in the numbers here is the carbon footprint, not the carbon footprint, but just the portion of the personal carbon footprint that relates to the food, right? And as you see in the title of the paper, this is about people eating a vegan diet. So the change makers are plant-based people who want to convince everyone to eat plant-based foods because it lowers the carbon footprint of their food basket. Okay? I'm sure I'll get lots of questions about that. So you can see here where these numbers, lower numbers better, right? Carbon footprint or carbon footprint. This is sort of like where you start to see a tipping point is surpassed. So if the uptake rate's 0, basically like the R value with COVID, you're never going to get people moving into the change makers cohort. But as soon as you start being a value greater than 1, then you start seeing this change. But you need quite a high commitment rate if your uptake rate's low. And of course, as you go further and further along there into the higher and higher uptake rates, then you don't need as much of a commitment rate. And so it never gets, the footprint value never gets below this. In this particular model, it was 1.97 tons of CO2 equivalent per person per year, because essentially all food's going to have a carbon footprint, but it's a lot lower than the 3.9 that people started out when they were eating a conventional kind of diet, traditionalist diet. And then you have this regime change. So then you're in a new regime. So that was kind of a detailed look, somewhat detailed look about how the socio-ecological contagion part is modeled, which is what all of the bottom-up scenarios in DARETOTIP are based on. Another one, I'm not going to go into too much of the modeling now. I'm just going to talk about the ideas for the scenarios. So reducing commuting in cars. I did drive here the last 2 days, but I haven't found Perth public transport super easy. Anyway, so you have a car-free movement, which is much like the people who were, they're the change makers, they're the Lisa Simpsons, the people who maybe go to critical mass events and ride their bike and say, we are traffic. And then you've obviously got your top-down approaches that could be congestion charges, they could be increased parking charges, they could be not allowing cars inside the central city. So there are lots of different ways you can put barriers there, of course. This is now getting into the realm of probably people in this room more than me, so I look forward to your feedback. How this is modeled, just a sort of a causal loop diagram I'm going to show you. You start off with your car commuters and they're producing greenhouse gas emissions and you want to reduce that. So to reduce that, you have to reduce the people commuting from cars. So let's think about how we're going to get them to use public transport and bicycles to get to work. The car commuters are influenced by things like how long it takes to get to work and what's the congestion time. And the congestion time is then also influenced by the number of people in cars. And your bicycle, people who decide to go from cars to riding their bikes, obviously it's about safety and it's probably about things like visibility, so safety in numbers. So the more and more people who cycle to work, probably the more other people start to think that that's actually a good idea as well. So I like to be really visible when I'm out there on my bike. Then the top-down sort of interventions, we could think about the cost of driving, things I mentioned earlier, congestion charges, parking price, fuel price. We recently had a new government elected in New Zealand and there was a fuel tax for being inside Auckland City, and they just decided to remove that. So these are the kind of things that I'm interested in modelling. What's going to happen now that we don't have that that fuel levy? And then, of course, the bicycle commuters, well, we can improve the bicycle infrastructure, which then makes it a bit safer for people, which is going to help that reinforcing feedback loop. That's a reinforcing feedback loop, right? So more visibility, more safety, more bike commuters, more visibility, more safety, more bike commuters. And then, of course, public transport, to use another example from New Zealand and Auckland, the buses often don't come, so people stop using them, and then the council says, well, no one's using the buses. So improving that kind of thing obviously helps people feel confident that they can give up their car. The cycling to work movement, on the other hand, without these top-down interventions, has the socio-ecological contagion model, like I showed you with the food print. Okay, so you've got the change makers, the people that are saying, I'm not going to drive to work, and you shouldn't either. And let's get together and build this movement and try and put a little bit of peer pressure on each other not to do that, and think about what we can do to try and discourage other people from driving to work. And of course, that's going to then, once that starts to have an effect, you're going to be pushing those car commuters out into the public transport. Obviously, this is all very straightforward, but this is how I start to build these system dynamics models. I have to identify what are the variables that are linked by these influences. So I need a variable that's a cause, I need a variable that's the effect, and I need to know what is the relationship between those. That's how system dynamics works, as opposed to sort of the really data-driven stochastic models. Another scenario that I like to talk about is reducing short-haul flights. It's a bit harder to reduce long-haul flights, like I've got to get back to Denmark on Monday. But short-haul flights, particularly in a place like Europe, where you've got lots of different cultures, people might want to go on holiday, and it's not that far. So a short-haul flight that might be just 1,600 kilometres away or something like that, you can get there on a train normally because there's a good public transport in Europe. So you have this no-fly movement that's actually quite feasible. And this has really grown in the last few years since Greta Thunberg's become really present and encouraged people not to fly. And the stunt she did when she sailed the Atlantic to get over to New York. This kind of thing, like really promoting the no-fly movement. Most of the conferences I go to in Europe now, I find that people like to do a little bit of shaming on anyone who flew there if it was really close. And now I'm starting to feel like that little burden of pressure to not fly to those conferences if I could take a train, even though I might have to take an extra day to get there. All right. So the no-fly movement then can also lead to policy changes, like we saw last year with the French government saying that they're not going to allow these short-haul flights between cities that are quite close together and where there is a reasonable train connection within sort of 200 kilometres or something like that. Well, there shouldn't be a flight for that short distance. So that's where there's feedback loop between the bottom-up social contagion movement, which then allows for politicians to sort of feel that they have that political capital to make those decisions that they probably, they might feel they get voted out of their positions if they did it before the movement is ripe. Okay, but then we could just start with a ban before the movement started. So the reason I'm talking about all of these sort of alternatives with the bottom up and the top down is because I want to model basically the time that it takes to get to this positive climate tipping point from a number of different scenarios, bottom up and top down. And I want to understand whether, I wrote this when Donald Trump pulled USA out of the Paris Agreement, and I was like, no, now we need people to do things because the leaders are not doing the right things. So, so how much of a movement do we need to build to get to that same kind of effect where you've got, a big institution that has a lot of power, maybe doesn't use it very effectively, but has the potential to really change, our climate pathways. So I want to look at, these bottom-up and top-down approaches and see, maybe sometimes with big infrastructure like this, banning short-haul flights might actually help us achieve our climate goals better than a movement which is quite slow to grow, maybe. But maybe with something like food, that's something that's really hard to, it's really hard to tell people what foods they shouldn't eat. Because it's pretty private individual choice. So maybe that's something that's better to come from a bottom-up movement. But these are just hypotheses at the moment, and I want to try and understand that and quantify those differences in reaching those positive climate tipping points by the end of the 2-year project. I had some more causal loop diagrams here. So thinking about the short-haul passengers and the profit that's made from, probably it's repeating from the from the last slides a little bit. But basically, we want to shift those passengers out of those short-haul flights into buses, but then we also need to provide infrastructure for those buses, and we can think about having things like a competitive bus price. Obviously, this is, I think, everyone else's realm, not mine. And again, that's where I might like to get some feedback on how these mechanisms work when it comes to policy and governance sort of stuff, and trying to draw people out of those flights or cars. I've already talked about the no-fly movement. And then I talked at the beginning about with this, when I showed how the traditionalists and the change makers work, it's another scenario, reducing meat eating. Obviously, meat is pretty bad for the climate, but it's also really bad for water and habitat and a whole raft of things. So getting people to not eat meat, either through a plant-based movement or through something like a meat tax. In New Zealand, for the last few years, the government's been debating removing GST from plant-based food, not to actually foster this, but just to make it a little bit easier for people who can't afford food, right? Rather than taxing vegetables, fresh fruit and vegetables, get people to eat healthy food, make it affordable. But that's a kind of top-down approach where you remove a barrier for people that, you know, they might start eating less meat because it's cheaper for them to eat some vegetables. So there's a lot here that's out of my my expertise. You know, I'm a life cycle assessment expert, and I do a lot of system dynamics modeling, and so this is the numerical stuff that I'm good at, but I don't know very much about how all this policy and governance stuff works. So that's a little bit why I'm doing this little tour around Australasia, trying to maybe see if there are some people who I might want to collaborate with in this project, but also maybe in the future. Right, so the stakeholder participation in this project starts off with some interviews. So we're going to do these semi-structured interviews with a group of experts. Some of them have already been selected. I haven't started the interview process yet, but we're going to decide on the scenarios. So I showed you 3 basic scenarios today, but I want to have more scenarios than that. I really want to have a full suite of options and then benchmark them after I've managed to build the model to quantify how they reach these positive climate tipping points. Right? So I'm going to do these semi-structured interviews with a group of stakeholders. Let me know if you want to know more about that. And then there's going to be a survey that goes out to these people. After I've gathered their feedback, I'm going to send them out this opportunity to sort of to benchmark which they think are important, because I'm expecting that I'm going to get a lot of people with a lot of interests that they want to have published in this project. So I'm sort of going to whittle them down a little bit through a kind of an iterative Delphi process. And then I'm going to have a workshop. And originally, when I wrote this pre-pandemic, I thought that would be really nice to get all of these experts who are participating in my project around in the same room. But I think now it's just a bit more sensible to get people to join on an online workshop. And in this online workshop, there's going to be this kind of mediated modelling process where we take all of the scenarios that have been developed in the first 2 steps and try and build the connections with the model framework, which I'm building right now, so that these can kind of be plug-in type of modules to the modeling framework. Yeah, so that's all of that's all I've got about DARETOTIP. Yeah, and I'd really like to hear from anyone if they've got some feedback about how an engineer discusses economics, and if you've got some scenario ideas and you want to contribute to the project, I'm totally open for collaborations. I expect to publish 2 papers in this 2 years on this project, and then I'll also write kind of an opinion piece, which I'm thinking about setting to something like The Guardian or Conversation. Yeah. Thanks very much.
So on the French short-haul flight ban,
Yeah.
any evidence of perverse behaviour that people are taking 2 flights that are just slightly longer than the limit, so they can just do a hop out and back in again to just avoid this terrible public
That's a
transport?
really interesting point. It only came into effect. In fact, it was only announced last year. I'm not even sure if it's in effect. So I think that remains to be seen. But also with that policy change in France, it's really, I don't know how I can tie that to this social movement. Like, is it related? it looks like it's related because that social movement's been really growing in the last 5 to 10 years in Europe, and then that policy comes out. It might be unrelated. Yeah.
The issue with the top-down approach is that it could induce perverse behaviour.
Absolutely.
People who are really not
Yeah.
buying, not just even actually make things worse for that group who are not buying.
Yeah. That's really part of the point of system dynamics, is that it's supposed to reveal these emergent properties, right? So if you get the elements right and the influences that join this network together, you should be able to understand if something that you didn't expect to happen starts to happen. If there is one variable that maybe increases and produces these perverse effects. Yeah. Yeah. Perverse effects is interesting. Dave?
So it made me think of rebound effects a couple of times when we were talking.
Okay, yeah.
Like when you get the social movement to be cycling is successful and there's a cyclist on the road, then some people who wouldn't have otherwise driven will now be happy to drive because the road's less congested.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's fun. But the other thing is, okay, so I deal with policy people, and I'm not sure what your question is. Like, so, you know,
my research question,
you want from policy and governance expertise. So, what's the question?
Yeah, great. I want to understand. Let's go back to this one because I think I explained that mostly. I want to understand what happens when you introduce a congestion charge. Like, how many people are going to stop driving, and what's the curve there? Is it going to be a really delayed effect? Is it going to happen in 10 years' time?
So for that specifically, there's quite a lot of evidence from around the world where congestion charges have been imposed. So there's numbers for that, for London or? Yeah,
London's the only one that I'm aware of where there are numbers, but
okay, where numbers are available.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good point. I think that there are, maybe I picked the wrong example because maybe there is more data on that particular one.
But it raises the issue that it's going to be quite specific. You know, it's going to be depending on the specific type of mechanism that you're talking about introducing and the culture and system into which you're going to produce it. If you introduce it, you could strike difficult generalising.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, London's different from, I don't know, Nairobi, you know. So there are going to be different things happening there. And like Michael said, I want to understand if there are perverse effects that might come into play. And I think I've got 2 years to do this project. I want to collaborate with people because I want them to help me do the things that they're experts in that I'm not, so that I don't have to become really au fait with a lot of this stuff.
You mentioned that, sorry, I'm dominating questions. You mentioned that, you know, developing social movements is slow, but policy change is slow too.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, social movements can be slow, but
you sort of characterised social movements as slow, policy quick. And that's
I didn't mean to kind of characterise them quite like that. But I think that what I was saying was with the no-fly movement, although the no-fly movement, it's actually happened quite quickly. It's not resulting in, not that I'm aware of, in like a downturn in aeroplane production and people digging up runways. That's going to take a long time, I imagine.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But I was thinking of if you decide you want to go for a policy change and not the policy maker yourself, that's probably a 10 to 20 year project.
Yeah.
If you're lucky.
Yeah. If I go back to the Otto paper, so you've got all these delays that they talk about, that some things happen really slowly, some things happen very quickly. And that's where it starts to get kind of out of my area of expertise, right? And it's what you're saying, I think. Who wants to go?
Yes, please.
And yeah, I just wanted to ask if you thought about spatial pattern and contagion.
Sorry?
I've got a question about spatial pattern.
Oh, yeah.
And contagion.
Yeah.
And scale.
Yeah.
So if you think about, like, let's say green space management, keep a certain amount of green space. Green space, if you manage it at a broad scale, it's easy to make sure you get some areas. If you evolve management down to much smaller, instead of, let's say, city councils as opposed to regional plan, then those city councils will do what they can. Green space, but it's much smaller.
Yeah.
Potentially less ecologically valuable. Yes, they really coordinate well with each other. I think you've got a similar question here, where if you introduce a national level policy, then it might be optimal in some applications, where you might maximize some things, but there's other things that's where if you go down to a fine scale, it would introduce heterogeneity with that policy. And the degree to which you do that introduce heterogeneity is going to have an impact level of interaction in this.
Yep.
I'm just curious how you're dealing with scale
So first of all, you mentioned the spatial component. I'm not dealing with any not doing any spatial modelling in this particular part of the model, but I'm considering how that might be. That's kind of what I used to do, a lot of land use change modelling and ecosystem service changes resulting from land use change, that kind of thing. So that's something that I could bring into here because I know a bit about it, but I haven't. I've decided that there are some things that might be less important to focus on. With scales, I think some of these models, like the commuting, that's sort of an urban issue, and then there are other things like the short haul flights, which is probably a regional thing, like continent of Europe or North America and these kinds of things. Maybe in Australia, it's just Australia, but yeah. So the models will be applied at different scales depending on what the scenario is that I'm thinking about. Does that answer? Not really.
So let's say you were going to a policy meeting.
Yeah.
I found this stuff up.
Yeah.
You need to do this. And they're going to say, well, how big an area should I do that in?
Okay.
My local city centre, and I'll expand traffic from there. We're going into all.
Yeah, but so what I was saying is that with the car commuting, that would be an urban model. So I would really be looking at the top-down part of that would be urban decision makers applying some barriers to traffic in that city. That wouldn't be, Canberra saying what you can do in Perth. That would be Perth saying what you can do in Perth. Or at least that's how it would be modelled, right? But with the short haul flights, that's something that's at a national level. And so I'm not going to make all of these scenarios, I'm not going to model all of these scenarios at the same scale because it would be a little bit too much detail for some of those models and not enough for some others. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for your presentation. Really interesting. I love the qualitative aspects as well, so I think that's kind of where I just have a couple of questions. I was just thinking, obviously models are generalisable and so on, you need numbers and that kind of thing. But I would just suggest when you are looking at choosing stakeholders, it's really important to choose a diversity of stakeholders, so you get lots of different views. Just as an example, when you're looking at your model about bicycle uptake and cycling and so on, the thing that immediately sticks out to me, I cycle to work sometimes, if you look at cycle traffic on the road here, it's very, very gendered. So I would suggest that probably it's 90% men cycling and 10% women, something like that. I don't know if anyone else would agree. So there's something happening to do with gender there that's really interesting and probably important to unpack given that. Right? So it's quite interesting. And some of those things, I don't know how you can fit them into a model or what you could do, but I would suggest that some things that might stop women from cycling, for example, might be things to do with their perception of safety on the road. For me, that's huge. I feel like I'm not as visible. I'm not as aggressive, maybe, and things to do with collecting children from school and so on. So that becomes a big step in terms of trying to figure out commuting. So I guess that would just be my general query as to the extent to which you're going to take into account those diverse social perspectives in constructing a model, or are you more aiming to look at the kind of majority case?
There is a lot of breakdown of the population. At the moment, it's not broken down by gender, but it's broken down by wealth cohorts and by ages, right? The population, so the social contagion model, it's really a population or two population models if you've got one idea that's one value that's shifting. But each of those cohorts, or the traditionalists and the change makers, are modeled in age brackets, because different people of different ages are more likely to, well, for example, if you're retired, you're probably not commuting anyway, so we can remove them from part of the people we're trying to influence. Again, with the food, people eat different foods at different ages. With that socio-ecological contagion in Veganville paper that I showed, that broke down, was based in Canada, and it broke down the population into different age cohorts, and there's a food basket basically for all of these different ages, and of course young children are eating something different to old people. Maybe they're eating some kind of formula, and the old people are eating soup. I don't know. So these things have different environmental impacts. So that's broken down. It's not broken down by gender yet. Yeah, but that could be quite easy to just say 50% of the population is women, 50% of the population is men, or it could be a bit more diverse than that as well.
Yeah, it just might be that there are some aspects of the gender.
Yeah. Yeah. When I showed that, what is it? This thing here. Yeah, I'm not showing all the detail in the bicycle commuters cohorts, right? So of course there are going to be people of different ages there, and there are going to be people there who probably don't cycle because they can't afford to drive. But I haven't considered the gender aspect. But very willing to.
The gender aspect is Australian specific.
It could be.
Because if you go to Copenhagen, I suggest it would be quite.
Yeah.
But if you're looking for something, and you're trying to figure out, well, who do we need? And there's an element of the population that's not a structural reason.
Yeah. Well, the childcare thing's not so relevant in Copenhagen, for example, because men get a lot of paternity leave, and so you often see men doing the childcare duties, right? So those are also things to consider.
I just got a question about how do you validate these models? Why do I believe them?
Yeah, you don't have to.
I don't believe them.
So they are sort of validatable, but they are also exploratory models. So they're looking at potentials, and I showed it on the slide that talks about what a system dynamics model means to me, and it's not data driven. It's about scenarios. It's about looking at, if we increase this number, what happens? What's the sensitivity of the model to increasing a variable? But they are, we can validate these kind of models with historical greenhouse gas emissions, so we can do the climate part of it, but the social contagion part of it is there's no data on that. That's about varying this uptake and commitment value. That's why I showed the matrix, because you're basically looking at what's the coordinate of these two values that allows you to reach a regime shift. So it's more of a multi-dimensional kind of result.
I mean, it sort of comes out of engineering.
Yeah.
I guess engineers validate
So I could show you. I've got a hidden slide there somewhere, which I could show you a model that is validated. But basically, yeah, you're right. They can be validated, but actually, this isn't so much of an engineering process system dynamics. It's much more from ecological economics and, well, coupled human and nature systems kind of stuff, like what Robert Costanza was doing in the 90s with the, valuing natural capital and that kind of thing. So it's much less from the, engineers, they want to talk about data, right? I'm not an engineer in this room, but they want to talk about probabilities, uncertainties, and that kind of thing, which is not what quite so interested in. I'm interested in the sensitivity of a model when you change something. Yeah, but they are validatable. But this, well, I haven't talked about that, and this model is not validated. But it's possible. And some of those system dynamics models that I published recently have been validated on things like, well, the population is really easy to validate. You can just start the model in the past and see if it runs well for 20 years, and then start it again for today and project into the future. And you can do all that for greenhouse gas emissions, for things like if there's enough data, you can have how many people are commuting by bus. You know, there's historical data for that, so you can validate that, and then you might want to tweak a few of the variables, but it's not the same kind of validating process. It's like this fits pretty well. Yeah. A lot of people ask about that actually. Yeah, I should get a more succinct answer.
I used to.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
I also used to go to the conferences.
Yeah.
A lot of work, France,
Mm-hmm.
the commerce.
Yeah.
Also a group.
Mm-hmm.
Also European workshop. I have lost track of what the conferences
Yeah.
are now.
Yeah.
But that was promised quite a lot. They are also too flexible.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the one extreme, like if that you require few assumptions also to give you results.
Few assumptions or quite a few? I mean,
Well,
yeah.
Relative, you don't have to make up a lot of parameters.
Yeah.
If you want to study, for example, people's behavior in choosing
Mm.
amount of first, there is a lot of research.
There is with agent-based models. Yeah.
No, with economics.
Oh, you started out by saying agent-based models. Yeah.
That is hard evidence.
Mm.
See, when you try to model a lot more actual.
Sorry, a lot more.
A lot more. You need to ask him a lot. I want to.
Mm.
I am going to have. It's easier when you draw it, but when you actually you are going to have. Sometimes what you want to do is you have to go back to the discipline and borrow. So if you are thinking about transportation, for example, some people just make up when you cross across discipline, and that's what I saw in you would have an agronomist. It's in economy, there was a huge project. Head is a leader, was a physicist, and he was actually doing economic model. That can be a clever physicist. But no matter what he does, he cannot actually do good economic model. So it's good to work with. It's something where that has been studied within economics. It's good to borrow from data economics to structure what it becomes too flexible. So that's basically my experience from going to the conferences. I don't know which conferences you go to. How do you didn't say how do you have to how what the elements are, but you didn't say.
So it's implemented in a software called Simile. So Simile is it's a system dynamics specialist software that's not used by very many people. Stellar is another one that's a bit more well known, but I don't use Stellar. Yeah, and Vensim also. But I use Simile, and Simile is really you make a model composed of these state variables with flows that come in and out of them. So in the case of a population model, state variables, the population and the flow coming out of the deaths and the flow going into it are the births. And you might also have some migration flows as well from that population. And then you join that to variables or other state variables being the stocks, right? And those are joined then by causal functions, basically, right? So that's why I say it's not really data-driven. It can just be, a mathematical equation that joins these variables together. Yeah. I don't know very much about agent-based modeling. I did.
It's the same thing.
It's not the same thing because agent-based modeling tends to be stochastic. So there are usually probabilities about the decisions that people make, and then this is deterministic. So I tend to stay away from the probabilistic kind of modeling. I don't know why, actually. It's just my preference to use system dynamics. It's been what I did my PhD in, and so it's it's the modeling approach that I'm much more comfortable with. And I tried a little bit using sort of NetLogo, kind of simple NetLogo agent-based models, and I didn't find it very intuitive for me. Yeah. But you're right that the social contagion model is a model that would be it's a good application for agent-based modeling because it is about agents making decisions. But the way it's modeled in this is not using agent-based. Yeah.